Welcome to the Sleepy Navigator channel, where we'll set sail into history, where each account carries the weight of real lives that shaped our world. Here, far from the superficial noise of social media, we dive together into the true stories that textbooks never fully told. Today, you're not just a viewer, you're my traveling companion on a journey to the frozen heart of the 15th and 16th century Atlantic. Prepare to feel the cutting salt on your face, the penetrating cold in your bones, and the desperate courage of ordinary men who faced the impossible. We're not here to romanticize the past or create marble heroes. We're here to honor the memory of anonymous sailors whose names were lost in time, but whose sacrifices echo today in every journey we make, in every ocean we cross. Make yourself comfortable. Let your imagination sail with me through the most treacherous waters ever faced by humanity. Together, we'll discover how extreme survival wasn't the privilege of heroes. It was the brutal reality of ordinary people who chose to face the unknown when staying home meant accepting a life without horizons. This is a story of human resistance in its purest and most desperate form. How is it possible that history's most successful trade routes were, at the same time, the most deadly? It's a question that seems simple, almost obvious at first. Of course, navigating unknown seas was dangerous. But the deeper you dive into it, the more it reveals an astonishing paradox that defies all human logic. Where are you watching me from right now? Are you comfortably at home, perhaps in a heated armchair at 72 degrees Fahrenheit, or in a warm bed facing 46 degrees Fahrenheit? Maybe you're in an air-conditioned room, or even on the other side of the ocean, where ancestors once departed for the unknown. Tell me in the comments where you are and what the temperature is there right now, because it's incredible to think that no matter where you're watching me from, you're connected by a common heritage. We're all descendants, in one way or another, of those anonymous sailors who crossed these deadly waters 500 years ago. If you have Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, or even African surnames, your roots intertwine with these roots we'll explore today. If you were born in the Americas, your existence here is a direct consequence of what these men faced in the frozen oceans. Make yourself comfortable wherever you are. Adjust your position, take a deep breath, and allow your shoulders to relax. You don't need to take notes on this journey. You don't need to memorize dates or names. You don't need to be tense or alert. Let the words flow through you, like the Atlantic waves that our ancestors knew so well. Allow your mind to sail freely through these waters of memory, carrying you through the centuries to those wooden vessels that rocked under unknown stars. Close your eyes for a moment if you want. Imagine the sound of waves hitting the wooden hull, the creaking of masts in the wind, the salt crystallizing in the frozen night air. Feel the gentle swaying that cradles our narrative. You're safe here, warm, protected. You can simply let yourself be carried away by this story of courage and survival, knowing that, unlike those sailors, your journey today will be only through words, and you can always return to the comfort of your home. And as we navigate together through these waters of memory, crossing centuries of human courage and suffering, remember that this journey we take today is purely educational and contemplative. Each account I share has been carefully researched in historical documents, ship logs, and chronicles of the era, but our conversation doesn't intend to replace formal academic studies or specialized historical research. We're here to honor the memory of these anonymous men through their true stories, to better understand our roots, and to feel gratitude for the world we inherited from them. May our crossing through history be safe, respectful, and transformative. Ready to set sail? The sails are hoisted, the wind blows favorably, and the ghosts of these brave sailors await us in the mists of time. Imagine for a moment you're thousands of miles from home, sleeping on frozen wood, while sea salt literally crystallizes in your beard. Your hands are so cold you can barely hold a rope. And tomorrow, maybe you won't wake up ... This isn't a horror movie. This is how Vasco da Gama, Pedro Alvarez Cabral, and thousands of anonymous sailors survived the deadliest routes of the Atlantic, routes that killed more men than any naval battle in history. Did you know that in Cabral's expeditions, more than 50 men died of cold before even sighting Brazil? That sailors literally woke up with pieces of skin stuck to the wooden deck. That pork fat was worth more than silver aboard ships? These aren't myths or romantic exaggerations of history. They're documented facts in ship logs that survived the centuries. When we think about the great navigations, our minds immediately fly to romanticized images. Crystal clear blue seas, favorable winds filling white sails, and glorious discoveries under golden tropical skies. We see Vasco da Gama courageously pointing to the horizon, Pedro Alvarez Cabral planting flags on paradisiacal beaches, Ferdinand Magellan conquering oceans with heroic determination. But this is only one side of the coin. The other side is written with blood, sweat, and literally frozen tears. The brutal truth that history books prefer to soften is this: the Portuguese and Spanish, roots of the 5th, 10th, and 16th centuries, weren't romantic adventures. They were organized suicide expeditions. Each departure from Lisbon, Cadiz, or Seville was, in practice, a death sentence for at least 40% of the men aboard. The trade routes that built the Iberian empires crossed climate zones that forgave nothing, not even for seconds. The North Atlantic, near the coasts of Ireland, Scotland, and Brittany, where ice storms were weekly events, not exceptional ones. The passage around the Cape of Good Hope during the southern winter, facing Antarctic winds that cut like invisible blades through any protection. And in attempts to circumnavigate the world, navigations dangerously close to the southern tip of the Americas, where nature tested every limit of human endurance. Here's what no history teacher tells you in the classroom. Maritime cold is a completely different killer than terrestrial cold. It doesn't warm, doesn't negotiate, and has no mercy. It's humid, constant, and invisible. It penetrates through any barrier that 16th century man could create. It invades bones like a slow poison that kills, cell by cell, organ by organ. At sea, there simply was no concept of true shelter. This is fundamental to understand. There was no safe place on a ship of the era. Closed compartments, when they existed, were monopolized by captains, high-ranking officers, and valuable commercial cargo. The working mass, which represented between 85% and 90% of any crew, literally slept in total exposure on the main deck or in the humid and fetid holds, huddled among barrels of salt water and rotting provisions. The deck of a carrack or caravel wasn't the romantic deck from Hollywood movies. It was a raw wooden surface, constantly soaked by seawater, without any thermal insulation, swept by cutting air currents that came from all directions. During Atlantic winter nights, this wood transformed into a solid ice plate that sucked any body heat within minutes. Documents from the era, and here I speak of uncensored accounts, describe scenes that would make us cry if we witnessed them personally. The diaries of Pero Vaz de Camina, the chronicles of Joe de Barros, and accounts of surviving sailors speak of men with beards literally frozen and glued to the wooden deck. When trying to get up during frozen dawns, they left pieces of skin, hair, and sometimes even small fragments of flesh stuck to the surface. Clothes that hardened during the night like ice armor, forcing men to literally break the frozen fabric to be able to move. Fingers that blackened not from dirt, but from gangrene caused by extreme cold. Hands that simply stopped working, transforming into useless claws that couldn't hold ropes, open containers, or even bring food to their mouths. Feet that swelled inside improvised footwear until the shoes themselves had to be cut, because removing them normally meant tearing pieces of flesh along. And the most terrifying of all, many sailors simply didn't wake up. They didn't die screaming. They didn't agonize dramatically. They fell asleep on a cold night like any other and never opened their eyes again. Hypothermia took them silently, like a gentle ghost that extinguished lives, while they dreamed of home, family, and solid ground. The numbers are brutally honest when we analyze the official records of expeditions. On Vasco da Gama's voyage to India, from 1497 to 1499, 170 men departed. Only 55 returned alive, a mortality rate of 67%. Pedro Álvares Cabral's expedition lost at least 50 men before even sighting Brazil, most from diseases related to extreme cold and malnutrition. Ferdinand Magellan departed with 237 men in 5 ships. When the expedition was completed 3 years later, only 18 survivors returned to Spain, and Magellan wasn't among them, a survival rate of mere 7.5%. These weren't isolated accidents or particularly unlucky expeditions. This was the norm. Experienced captains planned their voyages, calculating they would lose between 30% and 60% of their crews. They recruited extra men not out of generosity, but because they knew they would need spare bodies to replace those who would inevitably die during the crossing. It was war logistics applied to maritime exploration. And even knowing these terrifying statistics, thousands of men continued volunteering at the ports of Lisbon, Porto, Seville, and Cadiz. Why? Because on solid ground, hunger and poverty killed with equal certainty, just more slowly, and without the possibility of glory, discovery, or enrichment. It was a choice between dying slowly at home or dying quickly at sea, with a minimal chance of returning, transformed into a rich and respected man. This is the raw reality that shaped our civilization. Ordinary men choosing probable death in exchange for possible life, navigating waters that were, literally, floating liquid cemeteries. If you imagine the secret was wearing a good winter jacket, prepare for a completely different and brutally creative reality. The survival clothing of sailors during the Great Navigations was a desperate exercise in human ingenuity against the brutal limitations of the era. First, we need to understand what was available. The protective materials of the 15th and 16th centuries were primitive by our standards. There were no synthetic fabrics, advanced thermal insulations, or chemical waterproofing. Protection against the deadly cold of the Atlantic depended on 3 basic materials: wool, linen, and cotton, and each had specific properties that could mean the difference between life and death. Wool was liquid gold for these men, not the soft wool of our modern sweaters, a thick, coarse wool, often repurposed from old clothes and patched until it looked like a human patchwork quilt. Why was wool so valuable? Because it possesses an almost magical property. It continues to insulate the body, even when completely soaked. While wet cotton and linen transformed into deadly cold traps, damp wool still offered minimal protection against hypothermia. The layering system was a survival science. Underneath, they wore loose linen or raw cotton shirts, not to warm, but because these fibers were more resistant to the brutal daily use of maritime life. Over these base shirts, they wrapped themselves in wool blankets, old cloths, animal skins, when they could get them, or literally any material that could retain body heat. But here we arrive at the most desperate and effective technique of all: greasing clothes with animal fat. Yes, you heard correctly. Sailors systematically smeared their fabrics with pork lard, beef tallow, or fish oil, creating a primitive repellent layer against the frozen water and cutting ocean wind. The result was nauseating, but it worked. Clothes impregnated with animal fat smelled like putrid carrion, attracted clouds of flies and worms, and over time molded, creating a disgusting crust. But when the choice was between smelling like a slaughterhouse or freezing to death in a few hours, the decision was obvious. The extremities were the most vulnerable points and required specific techniques. Hands were protected with fabric gloves sewn by hand by the sailors themselves, when they were lucky enough to have needle and thread. More commonly, they wrapped pieces of cloth around their hands like primitive bandages. There were no waterproof gloves or advanced thermal insulation. The result? Fingers blackened by frostbite were so common that losing entire phalanges was considered a normal part of the profession. Feet suffered even more. Boots were a luxury few possessed. Most used simple raw leather sandals, or worse still, wrapped their feet in rags, creating improvised thermal bags that frequently got soaked and froze during the night, creating blocks of ice around the feet that had to be literally broken in the morning. The head received special attention because sailors knew empirically what modern science has proven. We lose up to 40% of body heat through the head and neck. Therefore, they used wool caps, tanned leather hats, or simply wrapped any available fabric around their heads like improvised turbans. But the secret wasn't just in dressing, it was in keeping clothes dry. This was an obsession that determined who lived and who died. Sailors knew that a single piece of wet clothing could trigger fatal hypothermia within hours. So whenever weather permitted, even for a few minutes of weak sun, they rushed to expose their clothes to wind and heat, even if it meant temporarily being naked in the cold. It was a deadly balance, risking immediate cold to avoid certain death later. The way of wearing layers was a technique refined by centuries of trial and error. Tight clothes were avoided because they eliminated the insulating air between layers. Every opening, neck, wrists, ankles, was carefully sealed with cloth strips to prevent air currents. Sailors even developed methods to adjust clothes quickly, outer gloves that could be removed in seconds for delicate tasks, without exposing hands to deadly air for more than a few moments. Salt water was a constant enemy. Besides freezing faster than fresh water, salt impregnated fabrics, creating abrasive crystals that hurt skin and accelerated clothing wear. Many boats carried fish oil and lard, not just for sail and hull maintenance, but specifically to coat crew clothing. The smell was unbearable, but irrelevant in the face of death. Documents from the era describe sailors who preferred to sleep in the same clothes for entire weeks to avoid the dangerous work of drying leg pieces. The odor of rancid fat, sweat, salt, and mold became a second skin. Repairs were a daily survival activity. Torn clothes couldn't simply be replaced. There were no department stores in the middle of the Atlantic. Sailors carried thick needles and strong threads, sewing patches over patches, often with hands numbed by cold and under rough sea conditions. At night, when cold intensified to the deadly point, they developed collective survival techniques. They grouped in close nets, sharing body heat like hibernating animals. They used old canvases and torn sails to create improvised microshelters against the cutting wind that swept the deck. Even with all these desperate techniques, extremities continued being points of fatal failure. Historical accounts document dozens of deaths from freezing that always began with hands, feet, or ears, areas where blood circulation was interrupted first by extreme cold. What was most impressive weren't the techniques themselves, but the human resilience they represented. Men who faced months of travel with this primitive protection, surviving storms that lasted weeks, temperatures that would kill modern people in hours, and conditions that would make trained soldiers give up in days. This brutal combination of simple techniques, ancestral tricks, and pure human determination allowed entire civilizations to be built on the bones of these anonymous sailors. Every modern trade route, every connection between continents, every product that reaches our ports today exists because men dressed in rags, smeared with animal fat, decided that dying trying was better than living without trying. If you imagine that great navigation ships had some heating system, some cozy fireplace or comfortable braziers, prepare for a reality that will freeze you to the bone. The brutal truth is that having fire on a wooden ship was almost equivalent to signing a collective death sentence. Imagine for a moment, you're in a structure made entirely of resinous wood, flammable fabric sails, waxed ropes, and pitch everywhere. A single careless moment with a flame, and the entire vessel becomes a giant bonfire in the middle of the ocean. There are no firefighters to call, nowhere to run. It's certain death for everyone aboard. Therefore, fire was the most controlled and restricted resource of the entire vessel. There were the so-called shipboard stoves, primitive structures made with loose bricks, stones, or pieces of stacked ceramic, usually in the stern or some isolated corner of the deck. In these tiny stoves, they lit a small, almost pathetic brazier, whose function was exclusively cooking, never heating people. And here's the nightmare. During storms, strong winds, or in the middle of frozen nights, This stove was strictly prohibited. Exactly when they most needed heat, when cold became deadly, was when they couldn't use fire. It was a cruel irony that killed thousands. So what remained for these men to survive the freezing Atlantic nights? 3 heat sources, and all depended on human resistance itself. First source, collective body heat. This was the main survival strategy, and also the most humiliating. Adult sailors, many war veterans, slept huddled like frightened animals, curled up against each other under torn canvases and filthy rags. The more bodies together, the greater the chance of seeing the next dawn. It was brutal mathematics. Share the heat or die alone. They created what they called human nests, groups of 6 to 8 men who organized in circles, with the weakest and sickest in the center, protected by the strongest on the periphery. During the night, they rotated positions so everyone had a chance to be in the heated center. It was a desperate democracy of survival. Second source, improvised microshelters. Sailors became masters at creating small refuges using any available material. Old nets, pieces of clothing, torn canvases, even empty barrels were stacked to form barriers against the cutting wind. These shelters were nothing more than precarious holes between supplies, but could make the difference between 14 degrees Fahrenheit and 23 degrees Fahrenheit, enough to survive a few more hours. Third source, alcohol, the deadly trap. Cheap wines, watered rum, brandy, and even vinegar mixed with water were consumed religiously to warm the body from within. Sailors swore it worked, and technically they weren't wrong for a few minutes. But here's the fatal problem that killed thousands. Alcohol creates a false sensation of warmth by dilating blood vessels near the skin. You feel warm, feel good. Let your guard down. But in reality, you're losing body heat much more rapidly. It's like opening house windows in winter, thinking it's warmer. Records document horrible cases. Sailors who drank too much to warm up and were found dead the next morning, smiling with peaceful expressions, as if they had died feeling comfortable while their bodies silently froze. There was also heat generated by physical effort, but this was a double-edged sword. Working on deck, adjusting sails, climbing masts, all this activated circulation and generated internal heat. The problem? Excessive effort led to exhaustion, sweat that froze in clothes, and increased vulnerability to cold. It was a deadly balance between moving enough not to freeze, but not so much as to exhaust yourself. Hot meals were rare miracles. When they managed to prepare soups or stews, maybe once a week under ideal conditions, it wasn't just food. It was medicine against hypothermia. A bowl of hot broth could raise body temperature for hours and give psychological hope of survival. But cooking at sea was a logistical nightmare. Fire had to be tiny to be safe. Fuel was scarce. The sea rocked pots, and any strong wind extinguished flames. Getting a hot meal required 3 impossible factors to align: calm sea, favorable wind, and functioning stove. Therefore, they developed desperate heat conservation techniques. They kept portions of hot food inside their clothes, close to their chest, to maintain heat during the day. They drank warm liquids in small sips throughout the night. They chewed spices like cloves and ginger, not for flavor, but because they activated blood circulation. And there were superstitions that, paradoxically, saved lives. Some sailors believed that drinking hot broth and taking 3 steps backward scared away the cold of death. Others slept with iron spoons in their hands, believing the metal would attract heat from the ship. It may seem ridiculous, but these rituals kept men awake, active, and hopeful, and anything that prevented them from giving up mentally could be the difference between life and death. The most ingenious technique was creating human furnaces. In extreme cases, groups organized collective breathing inside improvised closed spaces. 6 men inside a canvas, breathing in a coordinated way, created steam that raised internal temperature by up to 27 degrees Fahrenheit. It was uncomfortable, claustrophobic, and stinking, but it worked. What was most impressive weren't the techniques. it was the mentality. These men transformed survival into a collaborative art. There was no hierarchy when it came to heat. Captain and sailor slept together when necessary. Solidarity wasn't virtue. It was absolute necessity. In summary, the heat sources available to navigators were their own body, the human collective, rare controlled sparks of fire, and a dangerous dose of desperate creativity. There was no backup, no plan B. When these strategies failed, men simply didn't wake up. Each night survived was a triumph of human ingenuity over natural forces that wanted to kill them. And what's most incredible is that it worked well enough for some of these expeditions to return, bringing maps, treasures, and stories that changed the world forever. This was the forge where our modern civilization was molded, not in castles or palaces, but in the deadly cold of the Atlantic, where ordinary men discovered they could survive the impossible when they had no other choice. Eating well at sea was already a Herculean challenge. Now imagine trying to keep a body functioning in extreme cold, eating only stone-hard biscuits, salted meat that resembled tanned leather, and muddy water that was frequently half-frozen. This wasn't just a matter of comfort. It was a daily battle between adequate nutrition and death by starvation. The feeding of sailors during the great navigations was governed by brutal mathematics. Each calorie consumed could mean the difference between seeing the next dawn or not. In the midst of oceanic vastness, where there were no markets, warehouses, or any external sources of supplies, crews depended exclusively on what they could carry before departure. And what they could carry was, frankly, depressing. The standard menu of maritime despair included the dreaded hardtack, the naval biscuit that became the symbol of food misery at sea, made only of flour and water, without yeast, salt, or any flavor. This cracker was designed for a single function, to survive months or years without rotting. The result was an edible brick, so hard it broke teeth. Sailors developed specific techniques to make hardtack minimally edible. They soaked the biscuits in salt water, weak wine, or even urine when fresh water was scarce. They beat the crackers with hammers to break them into smaller pieces. Some even boiled the fragments to create a mushy paste they could swallow without chewing. Salted meats were even more challenging. Pieces of beef, pork, or fish were preserved in coarse salt until they acquired the consistency of tanned leather. To make them edible, sailors had to cut them into microscopic slices and chew them for hours, or boil them in salt water until they softened minimally. But here's the secret that saved lives. Fat was liquid gold. Sailors knew intuitively what modern science has proven. Fat provides more than double the calories per gram compared to carbohydrates or proteins. Therefore, butter, lard, fish oil, and tallow were consumed like medicines. They literally ate spoonfuls of pure fat as if they were vitamin supplements. Pemmican was the energy bar of the era, a mixture of pulverized dried meat with animal fat that provided concentrated energy in small volumes. It looked and tasted like dog food, but contained up to 500 calories per 100 grams and could sustain a man for entire days. Caloric needs were astronomically high. A sailor working in extreme cold burned between 5,000 and 6,000 calories daily, equivalent to eating 12 hamburgers or 3 complete Christmas dinners every day just to maintain body weight. This wasn't gluttony. It was survival mathematics. Preparing hot meals was a miracle that happened perhaps once a week. To cook soups or stews, it was necessary for 3 impossible conditions to align simultaneously: calm sea, functioning stove, and available provisions. The constant instability of ships, the mortal danger of fire, and fuel scarcity made each hot meal a collective celebration. When they managed to cook, they made stews with seawater, extremely dangerous, but common. They mixed pieces of salted meat with dried legumes when available, seasoned with vinegar to mask the horrible taste of salt water, and created soups that were technically edible, even if nutritionally questionable. On normal days, which were 90% of the time, all food was cold. Imagine chewing frozen leather and swallowing biscuits that felt like pebbles while your fingers are too numb to properly hold the food. It was triple torture: hunger, cold, and absolute gastronomic frustration. Therefore, they developed desperate techniques for preserving food heat. They kept hot portions from morning inside their clothes, close to their chest, to maintain temperature during the day. It was uncomfortable and stinking, but it worked. Some even slept embracing bowls of warm soup to absorb any residual heat. Hot drinks were treated like precious medicines. When they managed to boil water, they mixed it with vinegar, wine, or any available liquid and drank in tiny sips over hours to maximize the thermal effect. A single cup of hot liquid could raise body temperature for 2 or 3 hours. Spices weren't luxuries, they were survival medicines. Cloves, ginger, pepper, and cinnamon were chewed raw to stimulate blood circulation. Sailors knew these spices warmed the blood. An accurate empirical description of the vasodilating effects that improved circulation in frozen extremities. There were even food superstitions that inadvertently saved lives. Some believed that drinking hot broth and taking 3 steps backward scared away the cold of death. Others that chewing raw garlic in the morning protected against frozen diseases. They may seem like beliefs, but they kept men active, warm, and hopeful. The psychological aspect of eating was as vital as the nutritional. A hot meal didn't just serve to provide calories. It was a mental anchor against despair, fear, and loneliness that corroded the soul during months on the frozen ocean. It was the moment when they stopped being survivors and became human again for a few minutes. But cold created a cruel paradox. It suppressed appetite exactly when the body needed calories most. Extreme cold confuses hunger signals, creates nausea, and reduces the desire to eat. Sailors had to force themselves to ingest food even without appetite. In a food discipline, it was often the difference between survival and death. When provisions began to run scarce, and they always ran scarce, desperate creativity took control. They ate boiled shoe leather, ropes soaked in fat, even sawdust mixed with honey when available. It wasn't nutrition. It was pure determination to keep something in the stomach. Dehydration was a silent killer. Fresh water was more precious than gold, so they drank any available liquid, watered wine, diluted vinegar, even recycled urine when necessary. Dehydration in cold kills as quickly as in heat, but more subtly. What's most impressive is that these men not only survived, they prospered enough to navigate entire oceans with this primitive diet. They proved that survival nutrition doesn't need to be tasty or comfortable. It just needs to keep the body functioning long enough to reach the objective. This was the nutritional foundation upon which our modern civilization was built. Men eating leather and stone biscuits, while mapping routes that would connect continents forever. We now arrive at the darkest and most brutal part of this story. Aboard the carracks and caravels of the 15th and 16th centuries, cold wasn't just an annoyance or discomfort. It was a professional, methodical, and relentless killer. A silent executor who worked in shadows, choosing his victims with the cold precision of a clock. Hypothermia didn't arrive like lightning or a storm. It came like a whisper, like a gentle hand that caresses until it kills. It always began with uncontrollable tremors. The body desperately tried to generate heat through violent muscular contractions that shook grown men like straw dolls. Teeth chattered with such force that many broke molars, creating mouth wounds that bled and froze. In the second phase came mental confusion. Sailors lost coordination, spoke incoherently, made suicidal decisions. Documents from the era report men who, in full thermal delirium, removed their clothes thinking they were hot, the phenomenon we now know as paradoxical undressing. It was a self-imposed death sentence. In the third and final phase, eyes lost focus. Skin acquired a ghostly bluish coloration, and the body simply shut down. There was no dramatic agony, no desperate screams, just a final quietude that arrived like a sleep from which one never awakened. The most terrifying part? An apocalyptic storm wasn't needed to kill. Constant wind, Wet clothes and physical exhaustion were enough for dozens to succumb every week. It was a death machine that functioned 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for entire months. Ship logs, written with ink that frequently froze in pens, describe scenes that would make us cry if we witnessed them personally. Men found at dawn curled up between provision barrels, as if sleeping peacefully. But when they tried to move them, they discovered eyelids were literally frozen shut, beards glued to the wooden deck. When lifting them, they left pieces of skin, hair, and sometimes small fragments of flesh adhered to the frozen surface. The death ritual was brutally pragmatic. There was no time for mourning, no luxury of elaborate ceremonies. The body was quickly wrapped in the cleanest available fabric, often just filthy rags, and thrown into the sea without stopping the vessel. Without coffin, without elaborate prayer, sometimes without even a pause in work. The voyage continued because stopping meant more would die. But hypothermia was just the beginning of the nightmare. Constant cold systematically destroyed the immune system, transforming each crew into a floating hospital of mortal diseases. Pneumonia was the #1 killer. In crews already weakened by hunger and exhaustion, a simple cough transformed into a death sentence. Constant humidity and cold created perfect conditions for respiratory infections that spread like fire through dry straw. Gangrene attacked extremities with surgical cruelty. Fingers and toes, ears, noses, any part of the body where blood circulation was interrupted by extreme cold. Skin darkened, hardened, rotted while the person was still alive. There were no antibiotics, no advanced surgery, no safe amputations aboard. Sailors simply watched their own bodies rot piece by piece. There was also the mysterious naval fever, a lethal combination of high fever, bone pains that made grown men cry like children, and delirium that lasted days. Chroniclers of the era couldn't explain it. Some called it curse of the cold wind, others divine punishment for abandoning solid ground. What we know today is that it was probably septicemia, or generalized infection caused by wounds that wouldn't heal in extreme cold. Statistics are brutally honest when we remove historical romanticization. Vasco da Gama's expedition lost 67% of its men. Cabral lost more than 50 sailors before even sighting Brazil. Magellan departed with 237 men, and only 18 returned, a mortality rate of 92.4%. These weren't isolated accidents or particularly unlucky expeditions. It was the statistical norm. Experienced captains planned their voyages calculating they would lose between 40% and 70% of their crews. They recruited extra men, not out of generosity, but because they knew mathematically they would need human replacement parts. But the impact wasn't limited to the dead. Survivors returned forever transformed. Physically, they were human ruins, fingers amputated by freezing, deep scars where gangrene had been contained, chronic respiratory problems that pursued them for the rest of their lives, premature arthritis in joints that had been repeatedly frozen and thawed. Many returned crippled, blind, or deaf due to untreated infections. Emotionally, they carried traumas that had no name in that era. The brutal isolation of months on the ocean, the constant death of companions, the permanent fear of not seeing the next dawn, all this created what we now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. Many became bitter, distrustful men, incapable of readapting to life in society. Families received strangers back. Men who had departed as sons, husbands, and fathers returned as haunted ghosts, often incapable of showing affection or establishing normal emotional connections. Rates of divorce, family abandonment, and suicide among navigation veterans were alarmingly high. There were also the widows, thousands of them. Women who waited years for husbands who would never return, who raised children alone, who became beggars or prostitutes to survive. For each sailor dead at sea, an entire family was destroyed on land. The orphaned children of navigations formed a lost generation, youth who grew up without fathers, often in extreme poverty, carrying the stigma of being children of failures who couldn't return from the sea. And yet, even knowing these terrifying statistics, thousands of men continued volunteering. Why? Because on solid ground, poverty and hunger killed with equal certainty, just more slowly and without possibility of glory or enrichment. It was a brutal choice between dying slowly of hunger at home or dying quickly of cold at sea, with a minimal chance of returning as a hero. This was the real human price of the great navigations. Not just the maps drawn and routes opened, but tens of thousands of shattered lives, destroyed families, and an entire generation of men who traded their humanity for the possibility of changing the world. Each line connecting continents on modern maps was first drawn with blood, frozen tears, and human bones that rest at the bottom of the Atlantic. This is the true dimension of human impact, a haunted mixture of glory and tragedy that echoes today in every journey we make, in every ocean we cross. But then something happened that defied all logic of death. Some men not only survived, but found ways to prosper even in these hellish conditions. The most extraordinary documented moment occurred during Ferdinand Magellan's expedition, in the passage through the strait that today bears his name. For 38 consecutive days, they faced Antarctic winds with temperatures below 5 degrees Fahrenheit. More than half the crew was sick or dead. It was when an anonymous sailor, whose name was lost in history, discovered he could create human furnaces by organizing groups of 6 men in circular formation, breathing coordinately inside closed canvases. The collective vapor created microclimates that maintained temperatures up to 36 degrees Fahrenheit higher than outside. This technique saved more than 80 lives and came to be documented as the miracle of the warm circle. Another epic moment happened in Vasco da Gama's fleet, when sailors discovered they could use empty barrels as improvised thermal beds. They filled barrels with clothes, curled up inside them, and sealed with improvised lids, leaving only small holes to breathe. They spent entire nights inside these wooden cocoons and survived. These moments weren't planned by captains or strategists. They were desperate discoveries of ordinary men facing certain death. Despite everything, hunger, killer cold, diseases, and constant death, many sailors survived. And they didn't just survive. They wrote with their own bodies the beginning of globalization. How did they manage? It wasn't with advanced technology or sophisticated equipment. It was with 3 elements no university teaches: survival instinct, absolute companionship, and an improvisation capacity that borders on the supernatural. These men didn't have famous names. They weren't nobles, didn't come from rich families, don't appear in statues or monuments. They were anonymous, fishermen, peasants, adventurers with no future on solid ground. But it was exactly they who, with hands cracked by salt and bodies covered in filthy rags, crossed unknown oceans and literally changed humanity's course. And that's why telling their stories matters so much. Because when we see the great navigations in books, we admire the captains, the kings who financed them, the nobles who organized them. But we forget that it was ordinary men, like us, who made possible each discovery, each new route, each territorial expansion. Their courage wasn't heroic in the Hollywood sense. It was silent, it was daily. It was made of small decisions, sharing the last piece of dry bread, giving the only blanket to a weaker companion, enduring one more night of unbearable cold because giving up meant dying. Today, we complain when air conditioning is too strong. We turn on heaters when temperature reaches 59 degrees Fahrenheit. We buy $1,000 jackets to face an urban winter. Meanwhile, they faced 5 degrees Fahrenheit at open sea, wearing only rags smeared with animal fat. Just as sea salt slowly crystallizes on ancient wood, the survival lessons of these anonymous sailors also crystallized in humanity's soul. In the haunted silence of frozen holds, between the creaking of masts and howling of Antarctic winds, we find something much deeper than cold resistance techniques. We find the pure essence of human determination. These men teach us that extreme survival was never about sophisticated equipment or advanced technologies. It was about something much more primitive and powerful, the absolute refusal to accept defeat when there was still a breath of life in the chest. When they wore rags smeared with animal fat, they weren't just protecting themselves from cold, they were declaring war against impossibility. When they slept huddled like animals on the frozen deck, they weren't just conserving body heat, they were reaffirming that human dignity isn't measured by comfort, but by courage to face the unfaceable. Each hard biscuit chewed with teeth broken by cold, each sip of warm broth shared among dying companions, each dawn survived against all odds was an act of cosmic faith. Faith that something existed greater than individual suffering, something worth all sacrifice. The Antarctica of navigations wasn't at the planet's southern extreme. It was in these men's souls. A frozen place where only the most determined could survive, where each decision meant life or death, where fraternity wasn't virtue, but absolute necessity of survival. And perhaps the deepest lesson is this: they transformed the impossible into routine, not because they were different from us, but because they discovered that human limits exist mainly in our minds. When the alternative was certain death, they found reserves of resistance they didn't even know they possessed. Today, when we complain about small discomforts, are we honoring or betraying the memory of these men? When we give up at the first obstacle, are we worthy of the heritage they left us? The true inheritance of the Atlantic's deadly roots isn't the maps or riches. It's living proof that there are no limits to what we can endure when we have a purpose greater than ourselves. How is it possible that history's most successful trade routes were, at the same time, the most deadly? It was the question that brought us here. Whispered at the beginning like an enigma, it defied all human logic. After crossing these frozen waters of memory, we discovered we asked the wrong question from the start. It wasn't how deadly routes became successful, but rather how ordinary men transformed impossible routes into paths of glory through conscious sacrifice. The real question was never about statistics or commercial paradoxes. It was about what happens when human beings decide some dreams are worth more than life itself, and how this desperate decision becomes the force that moves entire civilizations. Perhaps the Atlantic routes never stop growing because they're not infinite in distance, but infinite in courage. Perhaps they don't need calm waters to be complete. They can expand through storms, make loops through generations, curve through connections. Our souls are just beginning to understand. Each wave that touches our shores today still carries the echo of those men. Each wind that blows brings the whisper of their torn sails. And somewhere, in the frozen depths of the ocean, their voices still sail. I hope this journey through history's frozen waters has warmed your soul, even if it chilled your spine. I hope you found peace in questioning the limits of human resistance, even if answers remain submerged under layers of mystery and admiration. Because this story doesn't end here. In the frozen mists of Cape Fear, the most dreaded place of all, Atlantic routes, secrets still sleep that would make these survival techniques seem like child's play. There, where dozens of expeditions simply disappeared without leaving traces, where ice storms lasted entire months, sailors developed survival strategies so extreme that their own captains forbade documenting them. In our next navigation through history, we'll discover these hidden truths that challenge everything we thought we knew about human limits.